All right, up next we have Emily Melzer, co-founder of Latde Diagnostics.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for this opportunity. My name is Emily Melzer. I'm a microbiologist, CEO, and co-founder of Latde Diagnostics. And I'm really excited to tell you today about what we're building at Latde and how we're developing tools to help guide appropriate antibiotic treatment. All right, so I'm going to assume that most, if not all of you, have had antibiotics prescribed for an infection before. And perhaps you've wondered, or maybe not, how providers decide which antibiotic they're going to prescribe. And so basically, when a provider has to make that decision, they have to balance questions like, is the pathogen resistant? Is it susceptible? Is the drug too aggressive? Is it too narrow? And will it be effective? And unfortunately, the truth is that in most cases, when providers make that decision of which antibiotic to prescribe, it does end up being a guessing game. And so, of course, there are many infections that we use antibiotics for. Today, I'm going to focus on urinary tract infections. The reason being that it is the most common outpatient infection in the United States. And so just a few numbers to put that into perspective. We see over 13 million cases of UTIs per year in the US. Over half of women will have at least one UTI in their lifetime. UTIs account for 5% of annual healthcare visits. This is over 10 million healthcare visits, which includes over 1 million emergency department visits and billions of dollars in healthcare costs. And what's interesting also about UTIs is that they are one of the only conditions that are treated in virtually every healthcare setting. Now, often people don't really tell their colleague or their neighbor that they have a UTI, right? And so we don't really, we can't really gauge just how big of a problem this is. But one infection that your colleague or neighbor would tell you if they had is strep throat, right? So just to compare this to strep throat, UTIs end up costing 10 times the amount of strep throat and lead to 2 times the number of healthcare visits as strep throat. Okay, so what does diagnostics and treatment currently look like for UTIs? Basically, a patient will present with UTI symptoms, go to see their provider, and then the provider will perform something called a dipstick test, which basically says yes or no to the infection. If the answer is yes, they will collect a urine culture and send that out to a centralized lab. And now after that, the provider has to decide, are they going to treat empirically, which is really just a fancy way of saying, are they going to guess which antibiotic to prescribe? Or will they wait 3 days until the lab results come back and then decide? And it turns out that this current standard of care ends up costing over $200 per patient in extra costs because we don't get those results quickly enough. And so what we're proposing at Latde Diagnostics is a point of care test kit that will be sold for $40 each. And basically what this would mean is that by condensing this timeline, providers would be able to prescribe the correct antibiotic within 90 minutes. It means that patients would avoid painful symptoms and complications, and we would save US payers around $3 billion each year. And so how are we proposing to do this? We're developing, as I said, a diagnostic kit. This is a 2-component kit that requires no specialized instrumentation. And so the first component of the kit is this incubation strip. Basically, it would be a panel of antibiotics that the provider would consider prescribing for this patient. And then we would allow for 90 minutes for the pathogen to be challenged or not challenged by these drugs. And then after 90 minutes, we would use this very simple detection method, which you all know from, at this point, 4 years of at-home COVID testing. I can't believe it's been 4 years. And so basically, you know that you don't need any special equipment to read this, right? And so what this would mean is that within, within 90 minutes, the provider would know exactly which antibiotic would be the most effective, narrow, and targeted option for this particular patient. And so what we've done so far is we've interviewed over 200 customers and stakeholders to figure out what else is out there and what are the current pain points. And so what we found is that current solutions can basically be roughly thrown into three buckets. One, I've already mentioned, is the culture-based, right? So this is the ones that are sent out to a centralized lab, and providers all agree it just takes too long. And then the other bucket, which is really more of the sort of up and coming solutions, and these come in the form of specialized instruments. Again, when we talk to providers, they complain about how these are too expensive, they're not right for outpatient settings, and in addition to the financial barrier, they also require maintenance and repairs and education, so pretty undesirable in many settings. And then finally, we have the bucket of tests that indicate some kind of resistance mechanism marker. And so providers, again, find these pretty undesirable because they're too limited and they don't really trust them. When we talk about the market potential, basically what we're looking at, if we look at the worldwide market for UTIs only, we're talking about $8 billion. In the US alone for UTI diagnostics, over $500 million. And then for early adoption in the US for Latde's solution, around $100 million. So far, we have been pretty successful at raising dilutive and non-dilutive funding to generate proof of concept data. We have filed a patent, and we currently have a working prototype. We are currently raising $1.5 million to support technical enhancement and improve the protocol that we use. And that should get us all the way to a design freeze so that we can then go ahead and raise a Series A to get us all the way to a product launch. So what have we been up to so far? I mentioned a mix of dilutive and non-dilutive funding. Additionally, we do have a vision for what the product will look like. We're still working with engineers to improve this for optimal workflow. But this is basically what our current prototype looks like. And we've already shown that with our paper-based diagnostics, we can detect growth of bacteria that were isolated from real UTI patients. I mentioned market validation. We have spoken to, of course, clinicians and clinical microbiologists, as well as payers and healthcare administrators to make sure that this is as valuable as it possibly can be. And we've been working closely with a leading contractor in the field of lateral flow development. So our goal for this is really to expand the market and make something that customers that can't use any of the current solutions can use. And so this basically includes any setting where UTIs are treated. And that means walk-in clinics like at CVS, urgent care centers, doctors' offices, university health centers, and nursing homes. These are some of the potential strategic partners that we would consider an M&A with and whose portfolios we do fit. And we've actually spoken to several of these and gotten really positive feedback from them. And we will continue, of course, to foster those relationships. Just to give you an idea of similar exits in this space, you'll notice that these two recent companies both acquired for over $400 million. I started this company with my co-founder, Sloan Segrist, who's also a microbiologist. She's a professor at UMass Amherst. And we've surrounded ourselves with experts in medicine, diagnostic assay development, chemistry, clinical microbiology, and business and entrepreneurship to make this as impactful as we believe it can be. Okay, so we basically, of course, like everybody else in this space, started this company to improve clinical outcomes around the world, right? And on top of that, both of us are microbiologists, so we worry about antibiotics not working anymore. And so this is a really important way to protect our antibiotics for our children and our grandchildren. And finally, because we took out the financial barrier for this solution, we think that this is also an opportunity to put life-saving and life-improving innovation in the hands of disadvantaged communities. So I often get the question about the name of the company, Latde. And so I'll tell you, this is called the Latde Stone. It's an architectural platform. And because we named the company Latde Diagnostics, because what we're developing is a platform technology. And so while we're starting with urinary tract infections, this could be applicable for a whole host of other infectious diseases, as well as sterility testing in biomedical manufacturing, food safety, veterinary medicine, and in vivo infection mapping. With that, I would like to thank you for listening and welcome any questions.
I have a question, if I may. So I'm not too familiar with the whole process of once they are tested, are you suggesting the drugs that they would be taking? So how do they compete with manufacturer compete with this is going to be the drug you need to take, or are you going to give them an option? And is this all prescription and how is that addressed? So those are my questions.
Yeah, good questions. And so basically what we're learning from clinicians is that there's actually a pretty small list of antibiotics that they would prescribe in these settings. And so these would be all of the drugs that they would consider anyway, but that we know would either fail due to resistance or might be too aggressive, erring on the side of resistance, and then lead to unnecessary complications. Does that answer your question?
One other point is, would insurance cover this?
Right, so good question. So there are CPT codes for antibiotic susceptibility testing that we plan to use. Yeah.
I think that was a fantastic talk, and anything to reduce the amount of time to get an answer from 9 to 24 hours once it hits lab. Is there a minimum bacterial CFU count or a minimal count of bacteria that you need in the urine in order to be able to see the result? Two, are there any potential inhibitors that you expect to limit the efficacy of the test?
Really, two great questions that we think about a lot, actually. And so as far as the limit of detection, luckily for us, for something to count as a clinical urinary tract infection, it needs to be above a certain colony count, which happens to be above what we can detect. That's great news for us. And then the second question, sorry.
So like with lateral flow type of things, there's some inhibitors that can be present in the urine.
Right. And so luckily lateral flow is already used for lots of other urine samples to test for other analytes. And so the urine itself, we don't expect it to interfere with the lateral flow piece of it. Yeah. Yes. Oh, awesome. Thank you. Please. Yes, absolutely. And it's a really good point that you're not expecting a patient to wait 90 minutes at the OBGYN, right, to get the results back. And so the way that we envision this being used in true outpatient settings is that the patient would leave and then the prescription would be called in later on. We already do this for a lot of things like strep throat, right? They take a swab and then they run a PCR. You don't wait around for 2 hours for the PCR. They call you a couple hours later and say, your prescription is waiting for you. And so that's kind of how we're envisioning this working. But you're absolutely right that there are some settings where this would be much more appropriate. For example, nursing homes, right? No one's going anywhere. So it can just be used there and then the patient is just staying. And so we will absolutely be taking that into account for beachhead markets because you're right. It does make more sense when the patient doesn't leave. Right, yeah. Right. And I love that you said that because sepsis was actually our starting point. And so I have a soft spot for sepsis. There are just a lot of technical issues with that we still need to sort out. And so we're kind of pushing that for future us when we have more resources to deal with it. But I'm glad that you think that it's a good fit for sepsis. So thank